Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. I realize it's been a while since I've spoken to you. One of the reasons is my increasing disillusionment with the American liberal class. They keep believing whatever corporate media throws out there and they seem to have no interest in hearing anything else. The other problem is if you go into my YouTube dashboard and you click on money, like this, I've done the review partner program terms, I've signed up for Google AdSense, and then it says get reviewed. YouTube will review your channel to make sure it complies with the YouTube monetization policies. We'll email you a decision, usually within a month. This step will begin automatically after you complete the first two steps. Notice it says in progress. It has said in progress since before Thanksgiving of 2020. So it should be painfully obvious that they have no intention of ever monetizing this channel. I lamented this fact a couple of months ago, and a few of you were kind enough to patronize me with Patreon or Venmo accounts. I remember saying that it was very difficult to keep going when I had to spend so much time doing something that remunerated me not at all. As many of you know, I'm a part-time truck driver and I'm working very hard to make ends meet. That's on top of my university full-time job. So it's difficult to keep plugging away with this when I know I'll never be remunerated, and I feel like there will never be a huge audience for people telling us what we don't want to hear. Too many of us seem to want to get back to brunch. And way too many of us want to swill the corporate Kool-Aid provided by people such as Anand Giridharadas. This article from The Atlantic, Welcome to the New Progressive Era, is a perfect example of narrative management. He's trying to tell us progressives that we were all wrong about Joe Biden. But before I launch into these dangerous waters, let me remind us where our actual compass points. This is from katiejohnstone.medium.com. The fact that Americans think Biden has changed things shows how narrative rules our world. So here's the truth we need to remember. Nothing of significance has changed since Trump left office, apart from the narratives about how much things have changed. That's where Anand comes in. The wars are still going. Washington is still the hub of an oligarchic globe-spanning empire. Americans are still being impoverished and propagandized into political impotence by an unfathomably wealthy plutocracy. Sanctions are still squeezing people to death in Venezuela, Syria, Iran, and North Korea. The world's worst mass atrocity is still continuing in Yemen. The kids are still in cages. Authoritarian creep continues to metastasize. All the old abuses roll on completely uninterrupted along the same trajectories they were on before. So then Anand comes in and tells us how wrong we progressives were about Joe Biden. And then he begins to spin his tale of how things are so much better now. And the corporate media swilling stooges continue to drink it up. Back to Caitlin. If you were to take the entire U.S. centralized power structure and assess its overall behavior as a whole, you would find that the actual behavioral changes amount to the tiniest fraction of a single percentile of the total. If you'd just been analyzing the raw data without looking at the news stories, you'd see that the money, troops, weapons, and resources have continued to move in more or less the same ways after January 20th as they were moving before. What has changed is the narratives, the stories that Americans are being fed by those who are responsible for controlling the way people think, act, organize, and vote. If you are a Democrat, you have been hearing that the country is now 1,000% better without the orange menace in charge. If you are a Republican, you've been hearing that it's 1,000% worse. In reality, in terms of the overall operation of the empire, both domestically and internationally, hardly anything of significance has changed apart from the narrative overlay. Here's an example from Pacific Standard. This is a tweet. A growing body of research tracked the detrimental impacts of Trump-related stress on broad segments of the American population, from young adults to women to racial and LGBT communities. At Jared B. Keller on the biological response to living under Trump. Back to Caitlin, which is not to say that nothing of significance has changed. It is significant that U.S. liberals are no longer being psychologically pummeled with hysterical narratives about a looming fascist takeover and their government being infiltrated at its highest levels by Kremlin operatives. This relentless barrage of emotional intensity has been literally making people sick. And the fact that they are no longer being psychologically abused in this way is not insignificant. So the actual US empire is chugging along in essentially the same way it was before Trump left office. But people's actual quality of life is different anyway, simply because they are being fed different narratives by the mass media. They truly feel inside as though they are living in a very different America now than they were prior to January 20th, even though as far as the real world is concerned, they most certainly are not. And this is just such a perfect illustration of how pervasively human consciousness is dominated by mental narrative. So much of our society is made out of mental stories in our heads. Identity, language, etiquette, social roles, opinions, ideology, religion, ethnicity, philosophy, agendas, rules, laws, money, economics, jobs, hierarchies, politics, government. These are all made-up conceptual constructs with no existence in the physical world, no existence outside our shared stories we've come to collectively regard as true. Our society is made up of collective narratives, and our experience is dominated by mental narrative as well. The majority of most people's interest and attention from moment to moment goes not to the raw data their senses are feeding their brains about the material world, but to thought, to mental chatter about a me character, which is itself ultimately just another conceptual construct, and all its adventures, real and imagined, what it wants, what it doesn't want, who has wronged it, and who has won its approval. For most people, present moment awareness of their actual surroundings is largely eclipsed by mental narrative the majority of the time. Caitlin's tweet says, "The real world and the narrative world. We each inhabit two very different worlds simultaneously, the real world and the narrative world. Manipulators exploit the differences between these worlds to trade narrative world currency for real world resources." And that, dear viewers and listeners, is why I started this channel so long ago with the Bernie or Bust television moniker. I could see that the narratives we were being fed had nothing to do with what we needed to know to change our world. You can be sure that if it comes from corporate news, there's no intention that we're going to use it to change our worlds. What corporate narratives do is keep us simmering in the pot. The last thing they want us to do is jump out. Back to Kate. So both externally and internally, human life is dominated by narrative to a truly massive extent. Is it any wonder then that the cleverest and greediest of humans expend so much effort working to determine what our society's dominant narratives will be? From news media propaganda to Hollywood to internet censorship to government secrecy to think tanks to Bellingcat to Wikipedia entries, vast fortunes are continuously poured into controlling the dominant worldwide narratives by the power structures who benefit from them. This narrative management campaign is so far-reaching and ubiquitous that even highly intelligent people are swept up in its manipulation simply because they are receiving the same narratives from so many different sources and receive insufficient contradictory input to create doubt in them. So it's my job, dear viewers and listeners, to create this doubt. And it's YouTube's job to keep my words from getting to any substantially sized audience. So please don't blame me for getting discouraged. As an example, how many of you knew about Caitlin Johnstone before you started watching my channel? She has a pretty big following, but she can't compete with the corporate media blob. She can't compete with all the politicians and newscasters who are paid for by that blob. But I keep hoping there will be some sort of mass awakening. I keep hoping that people who tell the truth will be heeded. But what it looks like instead is that we're all just going back to brunch after one racist rapist defeated another. The government continues on as it was before, and nothing is really going to change. And as I keep saying, it won't change until we pick up weapons or if we walk into the streets with our protest signs and we start to actually make demands as a people, as we the people. As Kate says, the dominant narratives all tell us the same few things over and over again. Capitalism is working great. Your government is your friend. The governments who oppose your government are bad. The truth is, the so-called liberal world order is a planetary status quo of non-stop murderous imperialism, exploitative neoliberalism, and ecocidal capitalism running underneath a propaganda soundtrack babbling endlessly about how everything is fine and it's going to get better any minute now. And it's all lies, half-truths, and distortions. The status quo is killing, oppressing, and exploiting human beings all around the world while rapidly destroying our ecosystem and putting us on an increasingly dangerous collision course with nuclear war. We will transcend our enslavement to mental narrative and evolve into a mature species with a mature relationship with its recently evolved capacity for abstract thought, or we will continue on our self-destructive trajectory until we meet an unpleasant end. And if I had to bet right now, I'd say it's pretty likely that we're on the last few steps of our final path. I'd been waiting a while to share that article by Caitlin Johnstone with you, and then I bumped into this one this morning by Anand Giridharadas. At first I thought he was being cynical. Welcome to the new progressive era. But he's actually being serious. He's saying that we were all wrong about Joe Biden. He says, Washington in the first days of the Biden administration is a place for double takes. A president associated with the politics of austerity is spending money with focused gusto, a crisis isn't going to waste, and Senator Bernie Sanders is happy. If any of those things are true, I'll eat my computer right now. If any of those things are even partially true, it's because the human race is waking up a little bit. And if Bernie fucking Sanders is happy, he shouldn't be. And neither should we be. And then Anand goes on to tell us that Joe Biden doesn't really stand for anything, but he just gets pushed into whatever's supposed to happen by all of us true progressives. And if you believe that, I've got a few nice bridges for you to buy. And the end of one of his paragraphs says, and many of us who thought we knew what a Biden presidency would look like and didn't expect much from it are suddenly asking ourselves, how did we get him so wrong? And then he quotes some boutique progressives like Ilhan Omar. Pramila Jayapal weighs in, Ro Khanna, other so-called progressives, and they're all frauds. Then they quote John Podesta. It's really terrible. I would rather you didn't even read this, because as you read it, I can feel your brains getting sucked into the vortex. That's why I'm hesitant to just read it out loud. They quote Robert Reich. People we've read and agreed with in lots of ways, but it's not real. And if you go back over the months I've produced this show, you'll see it's not real. Robert Reich isn't real, even though he says some really good things. Paul Street certainly isn't real. Most of the Bernie team isn't real, just like Bernie isn't real. He's just a real sheepdog. Representative Jim Clyburn has a lot to say, so you should take him at face value, right? Robert Reich says that Biden sees a parade and he runs and gets in front of it. The problem is this parade isn't real. It's being led by boutique progressives who are answering to the same corporate donors that everyone else is. None of them want anything other than incrementalism. They want us to believe that things are changing, but meanwhile we simmer in the pot. They call Biden a fingertip politician because he can find the political pulse, and Reich says that pulse right now is in an exceedingly different place than it was 30 years ago. If that's true, it's because of rabble-rousers like Caitlin Johnstone. Not to mention Jimmy Dore and Lee Camp. What we have is this morass of Democrats, from the so-called progressives to the right-wingers, and they all want basically to serve the same people. They want to serve the oligarchs. And some of them pretend not to want that, and others don't. And even if they come in with good intentions, they'll eventually get sucked into the vortex. And what do we end up with? The same thing that we've always ended up with. Some people are just gullible. Like Varshini Prakash, who leads the Sunrise Movement. She thought that they were actually listening to her when she was speaking. We went through them line item by line item, she says. We argued about all of them. The Biden team, I will say, was more amenable to things than I expected. And then Noam Chomsky puts his stamp of approval on it, saying that Biden's revised climate plan was largely written by the Sunrise Movement. And then Anand goes on to say that Biden is persuadable. The problem is Biden's corporate donors are not persuadable. And if the general consensus ever does push hard enough to the left, and that's very doubtful with the current narrative management we're swilling, it's not going to end up anywhere good. That's when even more obvious authoritarianism will rear its ugly head and the military intelligence complex will exert its pressure on our puny little skulls with its big fat thumb. I noticed that he quotes Brianna Joy Gray, a former Sanders press secretary and now the host of the podcast Bad Faith. Brianna worries that progressive priorities will be sacrificed for the sake of the Big Tent coalition, and that's very real. The minimum wage episode was an ominous portent for her. She thinks progressives should have threatened to walk out on the overall rescue plan. What good is winning the war of ideas if you lose every pivotal battle? And then Anand goes on to marginalize her. He quotes her, "I truly am not a maniac who is just like a Twitter warrior who doesn't understand that there are consequences to these kinds of strategic decisions," Gray told Anand. But choosing to fold every single time is how we got into the neoliberal hellscape that we're living in right now. And this is where he marginalizes her. Admittedly, sounding somewhat like a Twitter warrior, she added, "Joe Biden wants to cosplay as FDR, but is not willing to actually create a structural intervention that made FDR a 4-term president." And if you're wondering, Brianna, why, and I'm sure you're not, it's because the military intelligence complex would kill Biden the way they've killed others in the past. But there's no chance of that. We know that. Biden is a sack of shit. He's not going to do anything that will get his head lopped off. Even Ilhan Omar admits that the people who feel that progress they're seeing is not enough, they're right, it's not enough, she said. Progressives, she told me, are glad to be partners in creating policies that are addressing the problems we have today. Notice she doesn't say solving the problems, they're addressing the problems, but we are certainly not forgetting that there is more to be done. Oh, we're not forgetting, but we're not actually ever going to do anything. Anand says, "One thing is certain, Biden will not do everything the left flank of his coalition wants him to." And there's the revealing language, the left flank of his coalition. As long as you're the left flank of anything Biden's connected with, you're not going to get a damn thing. As long as you're inside the Democratic Party, you're not going to get a damn thing. And as long as we, the people, are relying on either party to do anything for us, we're not going to get a damn thing. The conclusion is that Biden is who he always has been, and if people are observing a change, it's because the terrain below him has shifted, not because Biden has shifted. And then Anand says that might be enough. Biden, he of the sensitive fingertips, quick to the front of the parade, recognized an opening when history ripped one open right before his eyes. Maybe he will lead the parade through that space into a new era, not because this has always been his crusade, but precisely because it hasn't. Because he, like much of the country, bought into the old assumptions, and he, like much of the country, now doesn't. Well, I'll believe he now doesn't, and I'll believe that the rest of the country now doesn't, when we take up arms and actually fix this shit. Our country and our world is messed up beyond recognition, but we keep believing the narratives that we're told. I'm a tiny little voice crying in the wilderness. I'm not going to be amplified by the corporate tools of YouTube or Twitter. If you, dear viewers and listeners, are able to listen to what I'm saying, you're still hearing it in the context of lots of other voices who are saying much, much different things. We don't have enough oomph to get this done. The people who are daily bathing in the corporate media narratives are not going to hear what I'm saying and have it make any sizable impact on their minds. You've all been so good to put comments under the videos. If you could say anything that would persuade me to believe that what I'm doing makes a tiny, tiny bit of difference, worth doing, please tell me. My substantial forehead is getting tired of beating into the wall.